To this day, I still wonder how something as thin as a sheet of paper could tear a 40-year life neatly in half. The envelope slipped through my door on a Tuesday, landing in a hidden corner of my entry hall as if dropped by a ghost. I remember that morning so vividly. The kettle warmed on the stove, steam curled up like memories rising, but my fingertips had gone cold, numb as winter air. I stared at the unopened envelope until I could barely remember my own name, afraid that reading it would spell the end of everything I knew. One quiet line on the page, a single phrase that stabbed through my heart, and in a flash, every photo of my family I'd ever cherished lost its color. I am 68 years old, and in some ways, a very ordinary mother. 7 years have passed since my husband's funeral. He left me more receipts from the hospital than chrysanthemums in a vase. My son, young Sue, is forever caught up in his busy office life. My daughter, Mijung, teaches in a faraway town, settling into her own routines. We keep in touch during holidays, send flower baskets for birthdays, and exchange safe, polite pleasantries that form a wall as much as they provide comfort. Though loneliness sometimes crept into my heart, I tried to find meaning, joining a writing group at the community center, lingering over nods and hellos with strangers on my daily walks. There was someone who made those days brighter. Junho Park, who volunteered by the calligraphy room at the center, was a quiet man, often acting before speaking. He'd help elders drag heavy carts, mop slippery stairs on rainy mornings, receive gratitude from everyone, carrying kindness so effortlessly I scarcely knew what to do with it. I was startled by how much his presence warmed me. It made me reckless enough, at this late stage in life, to imagine the possibility of sharing my final years with someone, maybe even walking together through the rest of our ordinary days. So, one evening, I decided I would finally tell my children about Junho, about my wish for new beginnings. But that morning changed everything. The envelope arrived with no return address, no sender's name. The words on the page were medical, harsh, covered in numbers and tables, a DNA test result. It spoke of an inconsistency in biological relationship. No direct names, only dates of birth typed in the margins. The date staring back at me matched my daughter Mijung's birthday. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Everything seemed suspended. The past, my guilt, my ability to move. I wanted so desperately to hold on to some version of reality. That evening, I was meant to gather my children to speak of my hope for companionship. And just as I felt ready to move forward, the shadow of my past swept in. Memories I had tried to forget, regrets I'd buried. My hands shook as I folded the test results and hid them deep within a kitchen drawer. The secret felt alive in the house, humming against the silence. Looking back, the younger years with my husband were a tangle of impatience and absence. He chased business, coming home past midnight, gone before sunrise. I tried to make home sturdy for our children, but loneliness found me in every corner. There was a time, after a fierce argument, that I felt so alone any gentle word could undo me. I hated my own immaturity, my neediness, and every night I convinced myself nothing had ever happened, even as the seed of regret took root. This DNA result brought those old regrets snapping back to the surface. That evening at the dinner table, I listened to my children's footsteps, the mundane sounds of their lives. My son sat across from me, phone buzzing with muted calls. My daughter passing food containers, asking about the food I'd made. I found I couldn't ask about remarriage. I couldn't mention the envelope, but I must have looked different, for the air in the room thickened, and my children, used to skimming over my moods, now glanced at me with a wariness that drew walls between us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared up at the golden pattern on the ceiling until it started to look like the outline of an old face. Again and again, my eyes landed on the photograph of my husband on the wall, my heart straining with silent apologies. I couldn't help wondering if some careless longing in me had ever wounded him or the children. In the gray hours of dawn, short messages arrived from both children, checking in, nothing more. And yet, every time I tried to reply, my breath caught. Every word felt heavier than it should. By morning, my secret was no longer mine. I don't know if my hands were careless or if the children were searching for something, but both had seen the paper. My son dropped by, offered a stiff nod. Later, my daughter visited and left with barely a word. The silence afterwards was more suffocating than any fight. It was a silence that stored resentment, confusion, and a rising tide of suspicion. From then on, our family grew further apart. Messages dwindled to dreary updates about weather and health. My son's phone calls dried up. My daughter stopped visiting, and I, too, found speech impossible, afraid that if I opened my mouth, excuses would tumble out, and I couldn't bear them either. I let silence bind me, punishing myself for a crime I couldn't even name. As the days dragged and the truth grew heavier, even the small comfort offered by Junho felt tainted, as if I no longer deserved any warmth not sanctioned by my children. He drifted by quietly, always gentle. Once, while holding a hand warmer he'd left for me on a park bench, I felt as if even kindness was a crime. In my guilt, I resolved there would be no happy plans for remarriage until my children found peace with me. Meanwhile, the DNA report haunted me. I memorized every code and number. I read the document with a magnifier, shining a flashlight on every margin. A tiny table at the end caught my eye: dates, codes, and the address of the lab that had processed the test. The submission date gnawed at me, matching the summer week 4 months before my husband passed, when he'd been in and out of the hospital. I recalled waiting in a parking lot as he went for yet another consult. But the lab was not part of the main hospital. It was a private office nearby. I could no longer drown in guilt without seeking the truth. I contacted the lab, sent documents to prove who I was. Days crawled by as I waited. I lived in a swirl where the past, present, and every imagined future twisted together. When the lab's reply arrived, I almost dropped it. Inside was a record matching my husband's name as the test commissioner. But the child's name was unfamiliar, though the date of birth was almost identical to Mi Jung's. The social security number was different, the address not ours, and the DNA had been submitted by a woman via courier. Handwritten notes from the lab tech explained that, by request, the names were masked, showing only birth dates on the final result. Was it possible this wasn't about my daughter at all? Had someone deliberately arranged for me to misunderstand, editing the document so only the birth date pointed to Mi Jung? My heart raced with suspicion. Who in our lives could have known how to cut so close to our family secrets? My mind searched for answers in the most familiar places. Trembling, I rifled through my late husband's study, remembering how he used to lock away important things. I found a small notebook filled with his handwriting, a calendar of hospital appointments, but also an unfamiliar name, written again and again, next to monthly payments, sometimes with the note for tuition support. The first digits of a bank account sat beside the notes. I needed air, flung open the window, watched the dust spiral as if even the air in the room held secrets. Around this time, my husband's younger sister called. She'd been present through his illness, cried hardest at his funeral, and lately had dropped hints about my rumored plans for remarriage. Her words stuck with me, especially now I suspected she'd been inside my home recently, close enough to catch the traces left in my drawers. Wanting the truth, I used the account information to request old transaction records from the bank. After hours of waiting, I found the same unfamiliar name showing up as the recipient, a modest sum sent every month with the note, tuition support. Searching online, I found that name listed as a scholarship recipient at a provincial high school several years ago. The guardianship line left blank. This name was neither foreign nor entirely familiar, holding an odd place in the story of my life. Then, another email arrived from the lab, this time with internal notes, confirming that while my husband's sample had been submitted in person, the child's had come via a woman who had sent the parcel under a Korean name matching my sister-in-law's, though written in Chinese characters. She had not shown any form of personal ID at the time of delivery, a further sign of secrecy. Suddenly, the puzzle fit. The paper sent to me had been deliberately altered. My sister-in-law had doctored the old DNA document, leaving only Mi-jung's birth date visible, crossing out names and codes, all to make it look as if my daughter wasn't my husband's child. She must have believed that by casting doubt, she could prevent my remarriage, or perhaps she hoped to transfer her own unresolved pain onto me. Whatever her motive, the results had nothing to do with my daughter. Instead, the DNA test had been about another girl, perhaps one my husband had been told was his, a rumor that, in his final months, he had tried to resolve. The test showed there was no biological connection, but out of kindness or duty, he continued to send small sums to that child's account. I had spent months racked with shame and terror, only to learn the accusation was never about me or my child. The true betrayal had come from inside the family, from someone wielding fear like a weapon. In that still moment, relief and remorse mixed within me. I was ashamed for doubting myself, for letting one piece of evidence undo my confidence as a mother. It took me too long to piece together the truth. I called my children to the house. Every step down the hall felt like an eternity. When they arrived, I laid out the lab records, the bank slips, my husband's notebook, and explained everything, sometimes with words, more often with the weight of my gaze. At first, confusion, then understanding, then their faces broke, transforming from suspicion to apology to something like forgiveness. We remained quiet, but the silence now felt warm, not accusing. Reconciliation arrived gently. My son busied himself making tea. My daughter lingered in the kitchen, struggling for composure. I let the moments pass, and in their eyes, I saw silent apologies returned. I knew then we could find laughter again, that wounds grow smaller when met with truth. Only then did I feel ready, at last, to share what I'd kept quiet for so long, my wish for companionship, for love not out of fear of being alone, but from the hope of finding joy again in my twilight years. My children nodded slowly, not with words of approval, but with gestures and breaths that told me they understood, maybe even supported me now. One bright weekend afternoon, I let the sun warm my face in the community garden, watched the wind sift through crepe myrtle branches, and saw Junho's patient figure waiting nearby. This time, I would step forward without hiding, walking my truth alongside his, knowing I had earned it. For once, I knew exactly who I was, and who and what I belonged to. Not long after, I sat quietly before my husband's photo. The smile in that old picture looked just as kind as I remembered. In my heart, I thanked him for the small mercies he showed, even when life pressed hard. I was sorry for the misunderstandings I'd never voiced and the compassion I hadn't always shown myself. A single page of paper, meant to divide, instead taught me the wisdom to slow down, to demand the truth, to speak doubts aloud rather than letting them rot in silence. Sometimes love calls for greatest courage, not in grand gestures, but in the everyday faith we hold for one another. Before I end this story, I find myself wondering, have you ever let fear and suspicion cloud what you know in your heart to be real? If life ever hands you a single scrap of doubt, will you trust your love enough to face it head on? Or will you, like me, find your way back only after taking the long road through shadows?